Thank you. When I agreed to participate in this panel, I had it in my head in this transition I was making from being a historian for 185 years of Hamilton to starting to think about Toronto and its working class history, that I'd use this as an occasion to do a complete overview of the work experience of Toronto workers across the 20th century. And then they told me I had only 20 minutes. So all I'm going to do is hit some highlights. I want to begin by sharing some time travel that I did recently. I was able to stroll down, stroll down Mulock Street early one morning in the spring of 1919. Mulock used to run south off St. Clair, one block east of Keele. And as you will notice looking across the street, it was not all, it was beyond the end of the streetcar line, something I didn't know until today. Interesting. It was lined with, it's one block east of Keele, so it's on that map out there, it's at the very far end, west end. It was lined with compact houses filled with working people and their families. Scurrying past me were more than 60 men who were heading off to jobs in the city. They had no time to talk and chat, so what I know about them is what got recorded in the city directory for that year. I quickly noted that there were virtually no white-collar workers here, just William Tiflin, a clerk who walked towards the streetcar with a stiff sense of difference on a street, from a street packed with manual workers in physically demanding jobs. Near the top of the street, I encountered Henry Cousins, one of 6 men on Mulock who were traveling to construction sites to ply their skills as carpenters. In the 1911 census, building trades workers had made up roughly 1 in 8 workers in the city, an enormous building boom that happened in Toronto in that pre-war period. Then Toronto's pre-war building boom had ground to a halt during the Great War, but in the year after the armistice that we're looking at this moment, they were finding much more work again. There were more than 12,000 of them in the city at that point. At the corner of Mulock and St. Clair stood a small foundry where Michael Hamilton and William Barry, the 2 molders who lived on the street, might have worked. Next door was a machine shop, which might have employed Harry Highland, any of the other 4 machinists who lived on Mulock Street. More likely, the street's 13 diverse metal workers were walking south and east to the huge Canadian General Electric Canada Foundry plant at Lansdowne and Davenport, which had opened in 1902 and made an enormous range of metal products. Or perhaps they traveled south to one of the many other metalworking firms in the west end of Toronto, such as Massey Harris. Some might have been walking west to jobs in the large CCM plant, which was making everything from bicycles to skates, and even for a period of time had made automobiles as the Russell Motor Car Company. And in fact, that company turned itself into a munitions plant, and this picture taken in 1917 is full of women who were working in that plant. Or perhaps they were working in the massive CPR car shops alongside St. Clair. John McCants and 3 others described themselves as engineers, which may have meant they drove trains, but more likely meant they were stationary engineers in charge of power equipment in industrial plants. Towards the bottom of the street, John Brimage stepped into the street to start his day as a butcher, as did 3 other men on Mulock. Chances were good they were heading west across Keele Street into the meatpacking district to start a working day at the Guns or Swift Canadian packing houses, close to the Union stock houses that had opened in 1903. This was Swift's here, and that's the stockyard. Halfway up the block, I passed Walter Breen, one of 2 men on the street who worked as conductors, most likely on streetcars. Nearby, George Johnson said he was a teamster and Aylmer Reeser a driver, 2 of the 5 on Mulock who evidently worked on horse-drawn or mechanized trucks. Toronto's massive transportation industry required huge numbers of these men, some 16,000 of them at that point, to move goods and people around the city. The largest group of men passing me on Mulock Street, however, described themselves simply as laborers. Most had Anglo-Celtic names, William Lawrence, James McCrae, and the like. while a few, like Michael Rokowiski and Stak Abramov, had evidently arrived from Eastern Europe. The city directory labeled the occupants of 4 households as simply foreigners. Chances are good that these were densely packed boarding houses where several men, perhaps Italians, had settled temporarily in order to be close to their jobs as close to their jobs as laborers, and would be heading home to their homelands as soon as possible. Historians call them sojourners. The market for all these unskilled workers, that's not very clear. I like this picture because it's on Palmerston Square, where I live, just a few blocks south of here, taken in 1904. But anyway, and it hangs in my dining room. The market for all these unskilled men was fluid and insecure in the early 20th century, and they probably moved between jobs in the foundries and the packing houses and the street construction sites and many other workplaces. The working lives of my friends here on Mulock Street don't provide a complete portrait of Toronto's working population. Notably, for example, no one on this street worked in the city's large clothing industry, which was centered further to the south in the Spadina district. And this was evidently not a neighborhood for the respectable members of the printing trades, who sustained the many branches of printing and publishing in the city. But they do suggest, my Mulock boys, they do suggest the general outline of an industrial city that had many jobs for a wide range of workers. In sharp contrast with the present, factories provided more work than any other single sector. These plants did less primary processing than many other manufacturing centers in Canada. None of Hamilton's primary steelmaking or Sudbury's smelting, relatively little of the primary textile production that kept towns like Cornwall going, no substantial pulp and paper mills like Espanola or Dryden. Rather, workers from Mulock and hundreds of other streets typically punched a clock in factories that made finished goods in large quantities that could be sent out along the city's extensive transportation systems. From beer and whiskey to pork products to dresses to machinery to furniture, including pianos, which were made not far from here in the Junction, to newspapers, magazines, books, and so much more. In 1921, the largest sectors were clothing and metal workers, each of which employed about 10,000 men and women. About half that number worked in printing. This reflected in part the very large markets, the larger markets in the metropolitan hinterland that Toronto producers could reach out to, and in part the demands of a city with a large middle-class population, a large population of middle-class consumers. The result of this industrial configuration was a highly diverse workforce with a wide range of skills. Since the turn of the century, Toronto's employers had been struggling with this complex set of labor markets, trying to reduce their production costs by developing new management systems and technological innovations that would speed up production and reduce their reliance on independent-minded workers. Indeed, by 1919, the city's industrial life had taken a major leap into what labor historians have come to call the Second Industrial Revolution, which was characterized by new, more centralized management, a lot of new technology, and the use of cheaper immigrant labor. One significant result was the emergence of a lot more semi-skilled workers who now operated some kind of machinery. And Toronto had lots of them in all sectors, from the Bell telephone operator to the streetcar motorman. The managerial revolution that had taken place was evident when I hopped on the streetcar, having walked all the way along to, where did you tell me it was? Anyway, I had to come east to get on the streetcar, and headed east on it to Appleton, which is just west of Oakwood. There, a bit later in the morning, I encountered men in white shirts and ties heading off to work in the much expanded front offices of Toronto businesses. William Curzon, John McCullough, and 3 others were preparing to take their places behind desks as managers. Norman Sinclair, an accountant, and Percy Hopkins, a geologist, were examples of a new kind of salaried professionals to provide expertise for company operations. I also noticed Mabel Rogers, who was hurrying off to her job as a secretary. I don't know how clear this is, but this is obviously not Mabel Rogers. But there was the typewriter companies love to put out these kinds of ads to promote their products and to suggest that the office was in fact a very sexualized space. The huge expansion of the managerial function within industry and government had opened up many new jobs for young women with typing and stenographic skills and some respectable polish to go along with them. At that point, Toronto had more than 15,000 such women, making up the largest single category of female employment in the city. Service and manufacturing ran close seconds at that point. All these people that I've just described on Appleton formed a part of a new middle class in the city, which brought together these new white-collar workers with the older categories of the self-employed, the lawyers, the shopkeepers, and so on. Well, the new managerial agenda for running Toronto workplaces was only partially successful, and the proof of the limited impact came in the form of the persistent resistance from the workers. Resistance wasn't easy, however. Toronto employers had a national reputation for anti-unionism in the early decades of the 20th century. The Toronto Employers Association was an aggressive body dedicated to helping company owners and managers drive out and keep out any unions that arose amongst their working people. But I chose the year 1919 to take my strolls in this neighborhood for a good reason. This was a peak year of organizing and militant demands amongst the city's wage earners, a part of what labor historians have taken to calling the workers' revolt. Toronto's workers shared the nationwide concerns about the soaring cost of living, the intransigence of employers in the face of demands for collective bargaining, the intrusion of the wartime state into their lives, including prohibition, and the need to ensure that the democracy that so many had just died for had a chance in the post-war world. Some of the workers I encountered on Mulock Street may actually have been heading off not to punch a clock that morning, but to join picket lines. John Brimage and his fellow butchers on the street were certainly likely to have been picketers. By the spring of that year, more than 3,000 workers in the 5 big meatpacking plants had joined a new local of the Amalgamated Meat Cutters and Butcher Workmen of North America, which, unlike the craft unionism of the past, reached out to all workers in the plants, including women, European immigrants, and even, apparently, Chinese workers. In early May of 1919, they used a strike to win fragile recognition of their union that lasted for the next year. Mulock's 13 metal workers and probably several of the laborers also hit the bricks that spring. On May Day, 4,000 workers in the city's metal trades, united in a metal trades council, went on strike for an 8-hour day and recognition of their council as the bargaining agent with employers. Speaking on behalf of the metalworking companies, the Toronto Employers Association had said a definitive no. So thousands of other workers launched their own, as thousands of other workers launched their own strikes in other industries, momentum began to build for a general strike in the city. Remember, this is the same moment when Winnipeg is going through exactly the same, more famous episode. A general strike in support of the metalworkers. For a few days at the end of May, a little-known story, a general strike did indeed take place in Toronto, including some 17,000 workers. The union representing Mulock Street's Henry Cousins and his fellow carpenters was among that group of supporters. But the support was not as substantial as in Winnipeg at the same moment, and the general strike was quickly called off. In Winnipeg, it lasted 6 weeks. The metal trades workers eventually suffered a serious defeat many weeks later. Among many other confrontations, I'll just note in passing, because we've been so focused on streetcars, was a street railway strike in 1920 that shut down not the city-owned street rail. This is in 1920. It's a year before the city is going to take over the privately run street railway. But this is one of many pics that have survived at the City of Toronto Archives, where people are climbing into the backs of trucks and wagons to be driven around the city during the streetcar strike, a good indication of how completely dependent the city was on streetcars. This whole dramatic episode of labor militancy from 1919-20 was ultimately short-lived. Most unions were soon defeated by determined union-busting employers or fell apart in the severe depression that hit pretty well all of Canada in the first half of the 1920s. So most of Toronto's workers, including those on Mulock Street and other neighborhoods along St. Clair, had no long-term experience with unionization before the Second World War. The Toronto District Labour Council continued to meet in its Labour Temple down on Church Street, but the delegates who showed up were typically from occupations where skills had survived and were not as threatened by the managerial transformation of the period. The building trades in particular held on, as they do today, with a persistent commitment to protecting their crafts from erosion or dilution, like these plumbers who were parading in a Labor Day parade in Toronto in 1930. Remember that one? The turning point for Toronto's workers came during the Second World War, when full employment, the relentless call to support a fight for democracy against fascism, and some new federal and provincial government labor legislation allowed several dynamic new industrial unions to recruit thousands of members and to begin serious collective bargaining. The Labor Day float of the Inglis plant, which is nowhere near St. Clair, but a very important plant in Toronto. Across the city, workers were signing up in all the major mass production industries. This time, the unions dug in their heels after the war, determined to survive, and by 1950, more than 100,000 they had more than 100,000 members, 3 or 4 times the number that had been in unions in 1919 in Toronto. For the St. Clair area, the most important disputes were the national strike, I emphasize national strike, of 14,000 packing house workers for 2 months in 1947. Everyone in the St. Clair area would have known about that. And one involving 125,000 non-operating railway workers across the country again for 9 days in 1950. A lot of people in the St. Clair area would have known that because the CPR shops would have been closed over by the junction. The railway workers' demand for a 5-day, 40-hour week was a harbinger of the new union bargaining agenda that was emerging after the war. Probably most important, most unions were able to settle down into relatively stable, long-term collective bargaining with major employers, a relationship that was tightly structured and supervised by the new provincial and federal labor legislation, but which guaranteed a level of economic security for vast numbers of working-class Torontonians never seen before in the history of industrial capitalism. A new era of working-class history had dawned. There was nonetheless a cross-current. The Cold War had caused a major split in the Canadian labor movement as the dominant social democratic leadership drove the communist-led unions out of the House of Labor. So by 1950, the United Electrical Workers Local at the Canadian General Electric plant down the road was no longer welcome at the meetings of the Toronto and District Labour Council. The rank-and-file workers in that plant, however, nonetheless continued to support that communist leadership until the plant closed in the 1980s, not because they were all card-carrying members of the Communist Party, but because the leaders ran a good union and got good contracts. It's equally important to take stock of how limited this new post-war industrial relations regime was in Toronto. Everybody wasn't included. Mass production and transportation were involved, but generally not small-scale employers in these industries. Within the booming construction sector, workers on the commercial and industrial sites still had their interests represented well through the building trades unions, but not those in the residential sector. Within these gaps in unionization were found many of Toronto's non-Anglo immigrant workers, notably the large numbers of Italians we heard about yesterday and other Europeans arriving after the war. By 1960, there were several more Italian names on Mulock Street, for example. Their experience with unscrupulous contractors, dangerous working conditions, and miserable pay eventually sparked an uprising of residential construction workers who had been ignored by the main construction unions. In 1960, they began organizing their own unions after finding no support from the old building trades unions and won a massive amount of public attention for their plight, especially after the deaths of 5 Italian laborers in the tunneling project through Hogs Hollow that spring. They met in the Italian Canadian Recreation Club on Brandon Avenue. That's not a very good photo of it, but I stumbled across this only last night when I wondered if that building still survived. In fact, it does survive, but it's now the Oakwood Wesleyan Church. Is the many reuses of buildings that we've been talking about in this neighborhood. That's one that's quite interesting. They met there, however, on Brandon Avenue, just south of here, just west off Dufferin, in the heart of the West End Italian-Canadian neighborhood. They were, in fact, known as the Brandon Union Group as a result of that. Their two tumultuous strikes throughout the Toronto residential construction industry in 1960 and 1961 were marked by a lot of violence as they sent out flying squads of pickets to show up on construction sites and confront the scabs and the subcontractors. But the experience gave those workers a new confidence and a new organizational capacity to bring better wages and working conditions to the city's construction sector. They came inside the House of Labor. This is them marching in the Labor Day Parade on September 1960 with signs that are proclaiming their importance. It's a huge breakthrough for these workers who had been so marginalized. These non-Anglo manual workers were not the only ones left out in the so-called post-war settlement. In the 1940s, hardly any white-collar workers were within the orbits of unionization and formal collective bargaining, other than a few groups working in the front offices of major manufacturers where the workers in the plant were unionized. At CGE, for example, the plant office workers were unionized in a separate local. The thousands of office workers who filed into Toronto's huge financial institutions downtown had steered clear of unions. Thousands of workers employed directly by the government or para-governmental or institutions like schools and hospitals were legally forbidden from joining unions. Only at the municipal level could they unionize, and usually only blue-collar workers. So today's CUPE Local 79, representing outside workers, got its startup charter in 1941. Gradually, however, through the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, the weak employees associations among public sector workers became more active in raising issues of workers, of wages and working conditions. In 1967, the federal government passed new legislation creating new possibilities for unionized civil service through collective bargaining. Ontario did the same 3 years later, and in 1974, the old Civil Service Association of Ontario transformed itself into the Ontario Public Employees Union, OPSU. Other workers in the parapublic sector followed a similar path, so that along with high schools across metropolitan Toronto, Oakwood Collegiate, about which we heard so much yesterday afternoon, was closed by a teacher's strike for 2 months in 1975. By that point, the custodial staff in the school had probably been recruited into a local of the Canadian Union of Public Employees, which was emerging as the largest public sector union in the country. By the mid-1970s, alongside the dramatic growth of the public sector unionism, two major shifts were taking place in working-class Toronto. Manufacturing industry had begun a long-term decline, and so factory jobs were disappearing. Along with countless others, the meatpacking plants on St. Clair closed, as did the large West End employers like CCM and CGE. By 2001, manufacturing jobs made up only 14% of jobs in the city. In 1911, 1941, and 1951, they made up 35% of the jobs. The other change resulted from the reform of Canadian immigration regulations in 1967, again referred to yesterday, which allowed people to move to Canada from many parts of the world previously barred. Immigrants that flowed in from many parts of Asia, Africa, India, and Pakistan, the Middle East, and the Caribbean. The city's workforce thus took on a much more racially diverse complexion. But as factory jobs disappeared, a greater preponderance of these immigrants had to find their way into the private service sector as cleaners, personal care workers, retail workers, and so on. And these have remained bastions of low-wage, precarious, non-union labor that I'm sure we're going to hear more about today. In the face of these changes, the Toronto labor movement changed considerably as well. Today, the Toronto and York Region District Labor Council brings together unions representing something in the range of 195,000 workers and has a strong record of building links among them and reaching out in alliances with other social movements. Their wonderful banner. A visit to the annual Labor Day Parade that they sponsor every fall reveals large contingents of construction workers because the city is still building, public servants because Toronto is still a capital city and Tim Hudak lost the election, teachers because the city's large populations need schooling, nurses because Toronto has extensive healthcare institutions, but only relatively small groups of unionized factory workers. There are also lively groups of unionists from the hotel employees, restaurant employees here, reaching into the service sector, representing many people of color working in Toronto's hotels, and from the United Food and Commercial Workers Union carrying signs announcing their determination to organize Walmart. In previous efforts to organize Eaton's in 1948 to 52 and in 1985, we learned how difficult it is, in fact, to win labor battles against major retailers. And today there are only a few outposts of unionization among Toronto's thousands of retail workers. Retail workers across Canada have now surpassed manufacturing workers just numerically. There are more retail workers in Canada than manufacturing workers. So, looking back over a century, we can see a generation of working people leaving home every morning in neighborhoods like those on Mulock Street and others spread along St. Clair, hoping to make a decent living at one of the host of diverse industries that were established in Toronto. Yet from the middle of the century onward, we can also watch the options begin to narrow and the opportunities for good, well-paying jobs for a large portion of the workforce start to erode as the city deindustrialized. And what about Mulock Street? Well, it's now been cut off from St. Clair. I actually only discovered this Friday morning when I went to take a picture of it, and I now see on the map that I think in the building of the underpass they must have decided that it could no longer come out all the way to St. Clair. But it survives as a string of aging but well-kept working-class homes, now mixed in with a few small businesses like a cheese factory, and also as a haven of ethnic identities and hyphenated Canadianism that continues to reign strong. Whether that's entirely clear, that's a Portuguese flag on a garden in the front of